There's a moment in every great story when a single decision changes everything, when passion, grief, or pride ignites a fire so fierce it reshapes the world forever. In the vast, echoing halls of Middle-earth's history, few moments carry the weight of Fëanor's oath. Picture this, a brilliant craftsman, his heart shattered by loss, standing before his kin, his voice trembling with fury as he swears an unbreakable vow. The Silmarils, those radiant jewels born of his own hands, have been stolen, and with them, the light of his spirit. But what begins as a quest for justice soon spirals into a saga of war, betrayal, and battles so devastating they echo across ages. Welcome, friends, to the untold stories of Middle-earth's most pivotal clashes, where legends are forged in fire and fate hangs by a thread. We'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, whether it's the quiet hush of midnight or the golden glow of dawn. Let us know in the comments below. Your journey into this epic tale is just beginning. Fëanor's oath wasn't just a promise, it was a storm. With his sons and followers bound by his words, their path was set. They would reclaim the Silmarils, no matter the cost. But none could have foreseen the bloodshed that would follow, the kingdoms that would crumble, or the lives that would be lost in the shadow of that vow. This is the heart of Tolkien's most tragic and majestic battles, the wars that defined an age. From the fiery ruins of Alqualonde to the desperate stands of Beleriand, these conflicts weren't just about power or land. They were about love, loss, and the terrible price of obsession. And as we explore them together, you'll feel the weight of every sword swung, every shield shattered, and every heart broken in the name of an oath that could never be undone. So settle in and let your imagination wander back to a time when the fate of elves and men hung in the balance. This isn't just history. It's a tapestry of courage and ruin, woven with threads of light and shadow. Whether you're a lifelong fan of the Silmarillion or discovering these tales for the first time, there's something here that will stir your soul, because these battles aren't just clashes of armies. They're moments where destiny itself seemed to hold its breath. And as we step onto these ancient battlefields together, you'll understand why the echoes of Fëanor's choice still resonate thousands of years later. The story is about to unfold. Are you ready to witness it? The journey across the Helcaraxë was never meant to be a path of glory. It was a march through the jaws of despair. Picture a vast, grinding wasteland of ice, where bitter winds howled like grieving spirits, and the very ground threatened to splinter beneath weary feet. This was the road Fëanor chose for his people, the Noldor, in their desperate flight from Valinor. Driven by his oath and the burning need to reclaim the Silmarils, he pushed forward without looking back, even as the cold began to claim those who followed him. The ice bridge was merciless, swallowing the weak and the weary, leaving behind only whispers of those who had fallen. And yet, Fëanor's resolve never wavered. His heart, once filled with the light of creation, had turned to stone hardened by grief, betrayal, and an obsession that left no room for mercy. But not all who followed him shared his single-minded fury. Fingolfin, his half-brother, watched as the toll of their journey mounted. With every life lost to the ice, with every cry of anguish swallowed by the wind, the weight of their choices grew heavier. Was this truly the only way? The question gnawed at Fingolfin, a quiet counterpoint to Fëanor's unyielding determination. Their people were splintering, not just by the cracks in the ice, but by the growing chasm between those who still believed in Fëanor's cause and those who wondered if the price had become too steep. The Helcaraxë did more than test their endurance. It exposed the fractures in their unity. Each step forward was a choice between vengeance and survival, between loyalty to a leader and loyalty to their own people. And as the Noldor pressed onward, the whispers of dissent grew louder. Some began to question whether the Silmarils were worth the suffering, whether any treasure could justify the slow, agonizing death of kin. But Fëanor could not turn back. His oath had bound him, and in binding him, it had bound them all. The ice would not break him, but it would change him, and in doing so, it would change the fate of Middle-earth forever. This was more than a crossing. It was the first true battle of the Noldor's exile, fought not against an enemy, but against the elements, against doubt, and against the unraveling of their own hearts. And though they would eventually reach the far shore, they would arrive as a people transformed, carrying scars that no fire could ever mend. The Helcaraxë had taken its toll, and the echoes of that suffering would ripple through the wars to come. The shores of Alqualonde were meant to be a place of beauty, where the silver waves of Valinor lapped gently against pearlescent docks, and the Teleri elves sang as they crafted their graceful ships. But on that fateful day, the music died. Fëanor arrived with fire in his eyes and steel in his voice, demanding passage. When the Teleri refused to surrender their vessels, his desperation twisted into something darker. The first blow was struck not by axe or arrow, but by pride, the kind that festers in the heart until it poisons every thought. What followed was unthinkable, elf turning against elf, kin against kin, as Fëanor's followers fell upon the Teleri with merciless fury. The sea turned crimson that day. The very air seemed to recoil at the clash of swords, the screams of the fallen, the shattering of trust that had held their people together for ages. This was no battle of honor. It was a massacre born of haste and hunger for vengeance. And as the last echoes of violence faded, a chilling silence settled over the survivors. The weight of what they'd done pressed upon them like a physical force. For the first time, the Noldor understood the cost of Fëanor's oath. It wasn't just their home they'd left behind in Valinor, it was their innocence. But the true horror lay in the aftermath. The Teleri had been unarmed, unprepared. Their only crime was refusing to aid a quest, already spiraling into madness. And as the Noldor boarded the stolen ships, the enormity of their actions began to dawn on them. Whispers spread like shadows among the host. Some wept openly, their hands still trembling with the memory of blood spilled by their own blades. Others, hardened by grief or fear, clenched their jaws and looked away. The divisions among them deepened that day, fissures that would never fully heal. And then came the voice of Mandos Doom, spoken not in anger, but in sorrow. His curse settled over the Noldor like a shroud, a prophecy of suffering and exile. Every step they took from that moment would be shadowed by the kin they'd slain, the trust they'd broken. The Silmarils, those radiant jewels Fëanor so desperately sought, now seemed less like treasures and more like chains, binding them to a path of endless strife. Alqualonde was more than a battle. It was a turning point, the moment the Noldor crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The blood on the shore wasn't just a stain. It was a mirror, reflecting the terrible truth that some choices can never be undone. and as the survivors sailed away, the waves behind them seemed to whisper a warning. The worst was yet to come. The flames at Loskr didn't just consume wood and sailcloth. They devoured the last fragile threads of unity among the Noldor. As the ships burned, their light flickered across Fëanor's face, revealing not triumph, but something far more unsettling. A man who had convinced himself there was no turning back. His reasoning was cold, calculated. With Fingolfin's host still stranded on the far side of the sea, there would be no retreat, no second thoughts, only forward into the gathering storm of Middle-earth. But what Fëanor called necessity, others would name betrayal. The act itself was swift, almost clinical. Torches touched hulls, and within moments, the harbor became an inferno. The crackle of flames drowned out the gasps of Fëanor's own followers, some horrified, others too weary to protest. Yet the true cruelty lay in the silence that followed. No warning was sent to Fingolfin's people, no explanation offered. They would learn of their abandonment only when the smoke reached them across the water, a dark smudge on the horizon, spelling out their fate. Stranded, with no way forward but the grinding ice of the Helcaraxë, and no way back to the home they'd already forsaken. This was more than a strategic decision. It was a declaration. Fëanor had drawn a line not just in the sand, but in the hearts of his kin. Those who had doubted him before now faced an impossible choice. Follow a leader who would sacrifice even his own family for his oath, or find their own path through the wilderness. The fire at Loskr didn't just strand Fingolfin's host. It severed the last ties of kinship, replacing them with something brittle and bitter. And what of Fëanor himself? In that moment, standing amid the embers, did he feel the weight of what he'd done? Or had the Silmarils, those glittering jewels he'd forged with such love, become chains around his soul? The flames reflected in his eyes might have been mistaken for determination, but look closer, and you'd see the truth. This was the flicker of a man who had burned his bridges, and with them, any hope of redemption. The aftermath unfolded like a slow, painful unraveling. Fingolfin's people, betrayed and desperate, would later name their trek across the Helcaraxë, at the grinding ice, a journey that claimed more lives than any battle. Meanwhile, Fëanor marched onward, his ranks thinner, his allies fewer, his heart hardening with every league. The ships had been a sacrifice, yes, but not to the cause of victory. They were kindling for the pyre of his own pride, and as the last timbers sank beneath the waves, something in the very air of Middle-earth seemed to shift. The shadows grew longer, the stars colder. For the first time, the Noldor understood the price of their rebellion, not just in blood, but in the slow erosion of who they had once been. Loskr was more than an act of arson. It was the point of no return. From that moment on, every battle, every loss, every whispered regret would carry the echo of those flames. And though Fëanor would never live to see the full consequences of his choices, the fire he lit that night would outlast him, casting its long, mournful light over all the wars to come. The first light of dawn had not yet touched the peaks of Mithrim when the horns sounded, a defiant cry against the gathering shadow. Fëanor's forces stood arrayed on the soil of Middle-earth for the first time, their armor glinting like shards of ice beneath the stars. Across the field, Morgoth's legions stirred, a tide of twisted forms and glinting eyes, their very presence fouling the air. This was no skirmish. no chance encounter. It was the opening stroke of a war that would define an age. Fëanor fought like a storm given flesh, his sword, gleaming with the light of his own making, carved through the enemy ranks as if they were mist. His followers rallied to him, their voices lifting in a song of vengeance that seemed to shake the earth itself. For a moment, it was enough. The sheer fury of the Noldor drove Morgoth's forces back, their lines buckling under the weight of a wrath they had not foreseen. But darkness has its own cunning. From the depths of Angband, the Balrogs came, their whip flames lashing the sky, their shadows swallowing the starlight. The clash was brutal, a dance of fire and steel. Fëanor, ever the flame, met them without hesitation. He fought with a brilliance that bordered on madness, his every strike a testament to the skill that had once crafted the Silmarils. Yet even he could not withstand their number. One by one, the Balrogs closed in, their blows landing like falling mountains. When the fatal strike came, it was not with a grand flourish, but a cruel simplicity. A blade through the chest, a searing pain, and then the slow, terrible knowledge that this was the end. But Fëanor did not falter. Even as his life bled into the dirt, his spirit burned too fiercely to be extinguished. His sons rushed to his side, their faces etched with grief and fury, but his final words were not of comfort or regret. They were a command, a reaffirmation of the oath that had brought them here. The Silmarils would be reclaimed, the war would continue, and with his last breath, he passed the weight of his vow to his sons, binding them to a path as unyielding as the stars above. The battle under the stars was a victory, but it tasted like ashes. The Noldor held the field, yet their triumph was hollow. Morgoth's forces retreated, but they would return, stronger, angrier, hungrier. And Fëanor's sons, now heirs to both his legacy and his curse, stood at the edge of a precipice. The oath had claimed their father. How many more would it claim before the end? The land of Mithrim, bathed in starlight and blood, bore silent witness to the truth they all felt but dared not speak. This was only the beginning. The siege of Angband stretched across the years like a slow burning fuse, tense, smoldering, waiting for the spark that would set everything ablaze. The Noldor, now settled in Beleriand, encircled Morgoth's fortress with a ring of steel and fire, their watch unbroken, but their unity fragile. On the surface, it was a strategy of patience, a way to starve the darkness of its strength. But beneath the banners and the brave speeches, the princes of the Noldor eyed one another with wary suspicion. Fëanor's sons, bound by their father's oath, stood apart, their loyalty to each other outweighing their trust in kin. Meanwhile, Fingolfin's people, who had endured the grinding ice, carried the weight of betrayal like a wound that refused to heal. The siege was supposed to be their triumph, yet it felt more like a pause, a breath held too long. Then came Fingon's gamble, a stroke of madness that would rewrite the fate of their people. High above the battlefield, chained to the cliffs of Thangorodrim, Medros hung as Morgoth's trophy, a reminder of what happened to those who defied the Dark Lord. The odds of reaching him were impossible, the risks were unthinkable, but Fingon, driven by a mix of pity and the stubborn hope that kinship might still mean something, refused to let his cousin rot. With nothing but a borrowed harp and the sheer audacity of his plan, he climbed where no elf should have dared to go. The song he played that day wasn't just music. It was a thread of light in the darkness, a signal to Medros that he hadn't been forgotten. And when the moment came, When Fingon's arrow found its mark and the chains broke, it wasn't just a prisoner who was freed. For a fleeting instant, the Noldor remembered what it meant to stand together. The reunion of Medros and Fingon should have been a turning point. Hands were clasped, oaths of friendship renewed, and for a time, the shadow of Loskr seemed to lift. Medros, humbled by his torment, even surrendered his claim to the High Kingship, a gesture meant to mend the rift between their houses. But trust, once shattered, is not so easily rebuilt. The wounds ran too deep, the memories too fresh. Fëanor's sons still whispered of their birthright, of the Silmarils that gleamed in Morgoth's crown like taunts. Fingolfin's people, though grateful for Medros' return, could not forget the flames that had abandoned them to the ice. The siege held, but the alliance teetered, a vase balanced on the edge of a table, waiting for the slightest nudge to send it crashing down. And Morgoth, ever the puppeteer, watched from the depths of Angband. He had learned the patience of mountains, the slow grind of erosion. He knew that time, more than any army, would be his greatest weapon. Let the elves posture and parley. Let them think their unity was unbroken. Every year that passed, every whispered doubt, every sidelong glance between cousins was another crack in their foundation. The siege was a stalemate, but stalemates never last. Sooner or later, someone would make the first move, and when they did, the walls would come tumbling down. The years rolled on, the siege unbroken, but the tension thickening like a gathering storm. The Noldor, for all their brilliance, had forgotten one crucial truth. Sieges are not just tests of strength, but of spirit. And theirs, though noble, was already fracturing under the weight of old grudges and older promises. The peace they clung to was an illusion, a brittle shell hiding the chaos beneath. And when the shell finally shattered, the calamity that followed would rewrite the history of Middle-earth. The earth itself seemed to shudder when Morgoth made his move. For centuries, the Noldor had held him at bay, their siege a gleaming noose around Angband's throat. But darkness does not starve, it festers, and on a day that began like any other, the ground split open without warning. Rivers of fire erupted from the earth, swallowing fortresses whole, turning proud banners to ash in an instant. This was the Dagger Bragelatch, the battle of sudden flame, and it was not a battle at all. It was an annihilation. Morgoth's armies poured forth like a black tide, their numbers dwarfing even the most fearful rumors. Balrogs strode among them, their whips carving through the air like lightning. Dragons, creatures of legend twisted into nightmares, took to the skies for the first time, their wings blotting out the sun. The Noldor, caught unprepared, fought with desperate courage, but courage alone could not stem the tide. Lines that had held for generations shattered in hours. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries burned before their rulers' eyes. The siege was broken, and with it, the illusion of safety. Yet amid the chaos, one figure refused to yield to despair. Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, stood atop the ruins of his hopes and made a choice that would echo through eternity. Mounting his steed, he rode forth alone, not to rally his people, not to strategize, but to challenge Morgoth himself. The audacity of it stunned even the heavens. No elf had ever dared such a thing, no warrior, no king, but grief and fury had forged in Fingolfin a resolve beyond reason. Across the scorched plains he galloped, his armor catching the dim light like a defiant star, until at last he stood before the gates of Angband and called the Dark Lord out by name. What followed was not a battle, but a tempest given form. Morgoth emerged, a mountain of shadow and malice, his hammer Grond ringing against the earth with each step. Fingolfin, a mere flicker beside him, struck first. His sword, Ringel, bit deep into Morgoth's flesh. Once, twice, 7 times, each wound a scream of silver against the dark. The Valor themselves might have held their breath, as the High King danced between blows that could shatter continents, his every movement a testament to the skill and wrath of the Noldor. For a moment, it seemed the impossible might happen, that light could topple shadow, but Morgoth was no mere foe, he was the enemy of all things. Slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. A hammer blow crushed Fingolfin's shield, another sent him sprawling, yet even as he fell, he struck one last time, hewing Morgoth's foot so deeply that the Dark Lord would limp forever after. The final blow came swift and terrible, but Fingolfin's defiance did not end with his life. His body, broken yet unbroken, was hurled aside, yet Morgoth, in his rage, could not bear the thought of eagles bearing it away. With his own hands, he sent Thorondor, king of eagles, reeling back, a rare admission that even in death, Fingolfin had stolen something from him, the myth of his invincibility. The Dagger Bragelatch changed everything. The Noldor's golden age was over, their kingdoms fractured, their people scattered. Morgoth's victory seemed complete. Yet in the ashes of defeat, something unexpected flickered, not hope, perhaps, but a reckoning. Fingolfin's duel became a legend whispered in the darkest hours, proof that even the mightiest darkness could bleed. And though the Noldor would never regain their former glory, they would not vanish quietly into the night. The war was far from over. It had only just begun. Gondolin had been built to stand forever, a city of white towers and hidden passes, nestled like a jewel in the encircling mountains. For centuries, it remained untouched by Morgoth's shadow, a refuge where the light of the Noldor still burned undimmed. Turgon, its king, ruled with quiet strength, believing his people safe behind walls so secret, even the stars seemed to forget their location. But no fortress, no matter how well hidden, can escape the corrosion of betrayal. Mieglin, Turgon's own kin, had long harbored a hunger that gnawed at him sharper than any blade. Envy festered in his heart, envy for Tuor, the mortal man who had won the love of Idril, Turgon's daughter, and envy for a throne he believed should have been his. When Morgoth's whispers slithered into his mind, offering power in exchange for treachery, Mieglin's resistance crumbled like sand. The secret paths, the hidden gates, all were laid bare in his confession to the Dark Lord. The attack came at dawn, but not with the slow muster of an army. Morgoth had learned patience in his centuries of defeat. This time, he unleashed his full might in a single, devastating stroke. Dragons, their scales black as polished obsidian, soared over the mountains, their wings casting shadows that swallowed the city whole. Balrogs, wreathed in flame, shattered the gates with blows that echoed like thunder. Orcs poured through the breaches, a flood of claws and steel, their screams drowning out the songs of Gondolin's defenders. The streets, once alive with laughter and the murmur of fountains, became a labyrinth of fire and blood. Tuor and Idril had foreseen this horror, not through prophecy, but through the simple, unshakable truth that no peace could last forever. In secret, they had crafted an escape, a tunnel leading from the heart of the city to the wilderness beyond. Now, as chaos reigned, they rallied the survivors, sheathing their grief in steel as they fought a desperate retreat. But the path to freedom was a gauntlet. At the pass of Cirith Thorinnath, the fleeing elves found their way barred by a Balrog, its whip cracking like a tongue of lightning. It was Glorfindel who stepped forward, his golden armor gleaming even in the dim light. What followed was not a battle, but a song of defiance, a duel of fire and radiance that ended with both warrior and demon plummeting into the abyss. Glorfindel's sacrifice bought the survivors their lives, but the cost was etched into the sky itself, where eagles later bore his body, as if the heavens refused to let his light be extinguished. The fall of Gondolin was more than the loss of a city. It was the unraveling of a dream. Turgon, last of the great elven kings of old, perished amid the ruins of his realm, his final stand a whisper against the roar of collapse. Those who escaped carried with them not just the scars of that day, but the weight of knowing they were the last. No stronghold remained, no hidden sanctuary awaited. The Noldor's final bastion had crumbled, and with it, the last hope of standing against Morgoth in open war. Yet even in the ashes, embers flickered. Tuor and Idril, their hands clasped around the small, bright figure of their son Arundel, turned their faces toward the sea, for in him, a child of elves and men, of exile and endurance, something new stirred. The age of hidden kingdoms was over, but the age of legends, that was just beginning. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad was meant to be the reckoning, the moment when all the scattered strength of elves, men, and dwarves would unite under one banner to break Morgoth's grip on Middle-earth once and for all. Medros, tempered by years of loss and regret, had woven alliances like threads of steel. Fingon's host from the west, the steadfast dwarves of Belugast, and the fierce Edain, whose courage burned brighter than their short lives promised. For the first time since the dawn of their exile, the Noldor did not stand alone. The air crackled with something long absent hope. But Morgoth, the great deceiver, had planted his own threads in the tapestry. The battle began with a roar that shook the mountains. The Union of Medros advanced like a tide of light, their ranks gleaming beneath banners stitched with stars and runes. For hours, it seemed victory might be within reach. The dwarves' axes carved through Morgoth's wolves like timber, while the elves fought with the precision of 1,000 years of war. And the men, the men, Huor and Hurin of the House of Hador, stood like oaks in a storm, their defiance holding the line even as the enemy surged around them. But Morgoth had saved his cruelest trick for last. The eastern forces, sworn to Medros' cause, never came. Betrayed by Ulfang's kin, their advance collapsed into chaos, leaving Medros' flank exposed. The tide turned in an instant. What followed was not a retreat, but a slaughter. The earth itself seemed to revolt, spewing rivers of fire and legions of fresh orcs from hidden tunnels. Glorung, the father of dragons, slithered onto the field, his golden scales impervious to blade or arrow, his very breath a weapon. One by one, the alliances fractured. The dwarves, though unbroken, were forced to withdraw. Fingon's host, surrounded and outnumbered, fought to the last elf, and in the center of the carnage, Huor made his stand, a circle of spears and shattered shields, buying time for the remnants of Turgon's army to escape. His final words to Turgon echoed like a prophecy. "From you and from me, a new star shall arise." Then the darkness swallowed him whole. Huron's fate was crueler still. Captured alive, dragged before Morgoth himself, he was offered a choice: kneel and reveal Gondolin's hidden location, or defy a god. Huron's laughter in the face of that demand became legend. He would not yield, not even as Morgoth twisted his body and cursed his lineage. His defiance cost him everything, but it gifted Middle-earth something irreplaceable. For in his resistance, Morgoth's attention turned away from the fleeing survivors, allowing Turgon's people to vanish into the mountains, carrying with them the last embers of hope. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad was not just a defeat, it was the unraveling of an age. The Union had been the last, best chance to strike at Morgoth's heart, and its failure left Beleriand bleeding. The elves, once proud and numerous, were now a scattered remnant. The men who had fought beside them were broken or enslaved, and yet, in the ashes of that catastrophe, something stirred. Huor's words, spoken in the shadow of death, would one day take flight, for from his line, and from Turgon's, would come a child who would change the fate of the world. But that tale, like the dawn after long darkness, was still waiting to be told. The forests of Doriath had never known a love like Beren and Luthien's. He was a mortal man, scarred by loss and exile, his hands calloused from survival in a world that had shown him little kindness. She was an elven princess, her voice capable of bending trees to song, and her steps lighter than the morning mist. Their love defied every law, every expectation, a union so improbable that even the stars seemed to pause in their courses to bear witness. But this was no fleeting romance. It was a flame that would burn its way into legend, proving that even in the darkest of ages, courage and love could carve paths where none seemed possible. When Beren stumbled into Doriath, half dead from orc blades and haunted by the ghosts of his fallen kin, he brought with him more than just his wounds. He carried a promise, one made to his father, Barahir, whose final act had been to save a king's life. That king, Thingol of Doriath, owed Beren a debt. But when Beren dared to ask for Luthien's hand, the price Thingol set was no simple test of valor. It was a sentence of death. Bring me a Silmaril for Morgoth's crown. The words hung in the air like a blade. To even speak of stealing from the Dark Lord was madness. To attempt it, unthinkable, yet Beren accepted without hesitation. And Luthien, though her father meant to shield her from the doom of mortals, refused to be left behind. What followed was a quest that wove together daring, magic, and sacrifice in equal measure. Disguised as a werewolf and a bat, they slipped past the gates of Angband, their very presence an affront to Morgoth's might. The throne room itself seemed to recoil at their audacity. The Dark Lord enthroned in shadow, the Silmarils blazing like captured stars above his brow. But Luthien's song, spun from the oldest magic of the elves, lulled even Morgoth into slumber, his nightmares trembling beneath her spell. In that heartbeat of stillness, Beren struck. The Silmaril came free with a sound like shattering glass, its light searing his flesh as he clutched it. But their escape was far from certain. The wolf Carcharoth, guardian of Angband's gates, awoke with a snarl, and in the struggle that followed, Beren's hand, and the Silmaril it held, was swallowed whole. They fled, bloodied but alive, carrying not the jewel itself, but the knowledge that they had done the impossible, they had humbled Morgoth. The aftermath was a tapestry of joy and sorrow. Beren, though maimed, had fulfilled his oath. Luthien, defying her father and her very nature, chose mortality to remain at his side. Their love became a hymn sung by elves and men alike, a reminder that light could pierce even the deepest shadow. But the Silmarils' journey was far from over. Torn from Morgoth's crown, it passed through fire and fang, winding up in the hands of Thingol, only to ignite a new kind of greed. The very jewel that had been won through love would soon become the spark for fresh betrayals, for Fëanor's sons had not forgotten their oath, and so the cycle turned, as it always did, from love to loss, from triumph to tragedy. Beren and Luthien's tale stands apart in the annals of Middle-earth, not just for its beauty, but for its quiet rebellion against fate. In a world spiraling toward ruin, they proved that even the smallest hands could leave cracks in the armor of the dark. Their legacy wasn't just the Silmaril, or the line of kings that would spring from their union. It was the unshakable truth that some things, love, courage, the refusal to bow, are stronger than any curse. The halls of Menigroth had stood for centuries as a testament to elven artistry, a kingdom carved from living stone, its pillars entwined with silver, and its vaulted ceilings alive with the glow of 1,000 lanterns. But no beauty, no matter how enduring, could shield Doriath from the curse of the Silmarils. The Jewel Baron had wrested from Morgoth's crown, now rested in Thingol's grasp, its light casting long shadows over a peace that had already begun to fray. The sons of Fëanor, bound by their father's oath like shackles of iron, could not look away. Where others saw a treasure, they saw a birthright, one they were sworn to reclaim, no matter the cost. When news reached them that Thingol had commissioned the dwarves of Nogrod to set the Silmaril within the Noglamir, a necklace of incomparable craft, the last thread of restraint snapped. The dwarves, though skilled beyond measure, were not blind to the jewel's allure. A dispute over payment. Some say greed, others say pride ended in blood. Thingol fell by their hands, his kingdom left reeling, and the sons of Fëanor, sensing weakness in the wake of chaos, saw their moment. They came not as supplicants, but as a storm. Celegorm and Curufin, whose names had once been spoken with respect, now led their brothers into Doriath with blades bared. The guards at the borders fell first, their loyalty no match for the fury of the Noldor. Then the gates of Menigroth itself were breached, the intricate carvings splintered under the force of their assault. Inside, the air was thick with the screams of the unprepared elves, cut down by elves, kin turning on kin in a frenzy of oath-bound violence. The Silmaril, clutched in the hands of Luthien's granddaughter Elwing, became a beacon of madness, its light reflecting in the eyes of those who would burn the world to possess it. Dior, Thingol's heir, fought with the desperation of a man who had already lost too much. His sons, barely more than children, were caught in the crossfire, their lives extinguished like candles in a gale. Nimloth, his wife, fell defending them, her last act one of futile love, and when the dust settled, Doriath was no more. Its tapestries smoldered, its fountains ran red, and the survivors fled into the wilds, carrying with them only grief and the bitter knowledge that no oath justified such ruin. Yet the Silmaril slipped through the sons of Fëanor's fingers once again. Elwing, barely more than a child herself, escaped with the jewel to the mouths of Sirion, where the last refugees of Gondolin and Doriath clung to survival. The oath had claimed another kingdom, another generation, but its hunger was not sated. The curse lived on, a shadow stretching toward the sea, and toward Eärendil, the half-elven mariner whose fate was still a whisper on the wind. The sons of Fëanor would come for the Silmaril again, and this time, the consequences would ripple beyond Middle-earth itself. The skies over Beleriand had never known such fire. For centuries, Morgoth's shadow had stretched across the land, his cruelty etched into the very bones of the earth. But now, at last, the Valor stirred, not as distant watchers, but as a force of reckoning. Their host descended like a tide of stars, their armor ablaze with a light forgotten since the days of Valinor. This was the War of Wrath, and it would not be a battle. It would be an unraveling. The armies of the West clashed with Morgoth's legions in a storm of steel and sorcery, their fury shaking the foundations of the world. Dragons, bred in the deepest pits of Angband, took to the skies in numbers never before seen, their wings blotting out the sun. But among them loomed Alqualonde the Black, a beast so vast his shadow could swallow cities whole. His scales were like plates of midnight, his breath a river of flame. For days, the war hung in balance, the fate of Middle-earth teetering on the edge of a blade. Then came Eärendil, the half-elven mariner, his ship Vingalot piercing the clouds like a silver arrow. With the Silmaril bound to his brow, he soared into the fray, a lone star against the dark. The duel that followed was less a fight than a collision of destinies and Alqualonde's flames lashing against the light of the jewel, until at last, with a cry that split the heavens, the great dragon fell. His body crashed upon the towers of Thangorodrim, shattering them like glass, and the earth itself groaned under the weight of his ruin. Morgoth's defeat was not a moment, but a slow unraveling. Stripped of his armor, his crown twisted into a collar of shame, he was dragged before the Valor, his once great voice reduced to whispers and snarls. His punishment was as final as it was fitting, cast beyond the doors of night into the void, where neither light nor shadow could follow, but the cost of victory was written in the land itself. Beleriand, already broken by centuries of war, could bear no more. The seas rose, swallowing kingdoms whole Doriath's forests, Gondolin's hidden spires, even the ruins of Angband itself, all consumed by the hungry waves. The earth reshaped itself, as if trying to wash away the scars of Morgoth's reign. And what of the Silmarils, those radiant jewels that had sparked so much grief? One still shone on Eärendil's brow as he sailed the heavens, a beacon of hope for all who gazed upward. The second had been cast into the earth's fiery depths, its light lost to the world. The third, it vanished beneath the waves, its fate a mystery whispered by sailors in storm-tossed nights. The oath of Fëanor had run its course, its hunger finally spent, but its echoes would linger, in the songs of the elves, the legends of men, and the quiet, unyielding memory of the land itself. The War of Wrath did not end with a cheer, but with a sigh. The age of the great elves was over. The maps had been redrawn, the balance of power shifted. Yet in the wreckage, something new stirred, a world where mortals would take up the threads of destiny, where the light of the Silmarils, though scattered, had not been extinguished. Morgoth was gone, but Middle-earth would never forget the price of his defiance. And as the survivors gathered on the shores of what remained, they carried with them not just grief, but the unspoken question, what comes after the end of an age? The shores of Sirion should have been a refuge, a place where the last survivors of Doriath and Gondolin could rebuild, where the laughter of children might one day drown out the echoes of loss. But peace for the sons of Fëanor had become an impossible dream. The oath still coiled around their hearts like a serpent, its venom growing stronger with every passing year. When word reached them that Elwing, the young daughter of Dagor, lived among the refugees with the last Silmaril clasped in her hands, the choice was no choice at all. They would come for it, even if it meant staining their blades with the blood of those who had already lost everything. The attack came at dusk, when the fading light turned the sea to liquid gold. The havens had no walls to speak of, no armies standing guard, only weary souls who had already endured too much. Medros and Maglar led the assault, their faces set like stone, but their hands trembled as they raised their swords. This was not war, it was butchery. Elves who had once called each other kin now fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. The air filled with the cries of the wounded, the crash of burning homes, the keening of mothers clutching their children. And through it all, the sons of Fëanor pressed forward, their eyes fixed on the tower where Elwing was said to dwell. She stood at the window, the Silmaril's light painting her face in hues of fire and ice. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, then spread her arms and leapt, not into the swords below, but into the sea itself. The waves swallowed her whole, and for a terrible moment, the attackers believed their prize lost forever. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, would not let her drown. She emerged transformed, borne aloft by wings of white, the Silmaril gleaming at her throat as she soared toward the horizon. The sons of Fëanor could only watch, their triumph turned to ashes in their mouths. In the wreckage of the havens, Medros and Maglar found no glory, only hollow victory. The other brothers had fallen, their lives spent in pursuit of an oath that had long since ceased to mean anything but pain. And when the twins, Elrond and Elrose, were discovered hiding in the rocks, orphaned, wide-eyed, so young, even the hardest hearts among them faltered. Maglar, the singer whose voice had once woven spells of beauty, took the boys into his care, though whether out of pity or penance, none could say. Years later, when the last two Silmarils were recovered, at last plucked from the ashes of a dragon's hoard and the depths of the sea, the brothers held them aloft with hands that shook not with joy, but with dread. The jewels, once the pride of their father's craft, now seared their flesh like brands. Medros, driven to the edge of madness, cast himself into a fiery chasm. The Silmaril clutched tight, as if it might absolve him. Maglar, broken beyond healing, wandered the shores alone, hurling his jewel into the waves before vanishing into the night, his voice lifted in a lament that would haunt the coasts for ages. Their end was not an epilogue, but a mirror reflecting Fëanor's own downfall with cruel clarity. The oath had demanded everything, and in the end, it had taken everything. Not just their lives, but their souls. And as the last notes of Maglar's song faded into the wind, the sea whispered the truth they had never dared to face. Some promises are chains, and some fires burn so bright they leave only darkness behind. The sea had always called to Eärendil, not with the gentle whispers that lulled sailors to sleep, but with a voice like thunder, urgent and unignorable. He was a child of two worlds, his veins a mingling of elven grace and mortal fire, and the weight of both pressed upon his shoulders as he stood on the deck of Vingalot. In his hands lay the last hope of Middle-earth, the Silmaril, its light undimmed by the centuries of blood spilled in its name. Behind him lay ruined Baliri, and drowning, Morgoth's shadow stretching ever further, and the survivors of Gondolin and Doriath clinging to the edges of the world. Ahead, only the impossible, the undying lands, forbidden to mortals and exiled elves alike. But Arundel had long since learned that impossibility was merely a challenge in disguise. His voyage was no mere journey across water. It was a crossing of boundaries, a defiance of fate itself. The seas rose against him, waves like mountains hurling themselves at Vingolot's hull. Storms born of Morgoth's malice sought to drag him into the abyss, and creatures of the deep, twisted by shadow, surfaced with jaws gaping wide. Yet the Silmaril's light cut through the darkness, a beacon even the waves could not extinguish. Elwing, now radiant with the power of the Valor's gift, soared above the ship as a great white bird, her wings brushing the clouds as she guided him westward. Together, they were more than husband and wife. They were a living bridge between the lost and the longed for, between the wreckage of the old world and the hope of a new one. When the shores of Valinor at last appeared on the horizon, golden and untouched by time, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Arundel stepped onto the sand, with the Silmaril bound to his brow, its light so pure it drew the eyes of the Valor themselves. His plea was not for himself, not even for the elves, but for all the free peoples of Middle-earth, men, dwarves, and elves alike, who had suffered under Morgoth's tyranny. The silence that followed his words was heavier than any storm. The Valor had turned away once before, grieving the rebellion of the Noldor, but this time they listened. The decision was not made lightly. To intervene meant to break the long silence, to stir the powers of the West into a wrath that would reshape the world. Yet in Arendel's light, they saw something rare and precious, not just a plea, but a promise. Here was one who bore the sins of neither elf nor man, who had loved and lost and fought not for pride, but for the right to hope. And so the Valor moved at last. Their host marched forth, and the war of wrath began, a tempest of divine fury that would end Morgoth's reign forever. But salvation came at a cost. The age of the elves, their long twilight of glory and grief, was drawing to a close. The world that emerged from the cataclysm would belong to men, its songs and stories shifting like the tides. Arundel, bound to the sky by the Valor's decree, became a star, a light for those who wandered in darkness, a reminder that even the smallest hands could change the course of history. His Silmaril, once a symbol of strife, now shone above as a beacon of unity. And though the elves would fade, their legacy lived on in every dawn that broke over a world freed from shadow, in every ship that set sail toward the horizon, and in every heart that dared to believe the impossible could be won. The dust had settled over Beleriand, but the weight of the past pressed heavier than ever on the shoulders of the Noldor. Once proud and numerous, their kingdoms now lay beneath the waves or in ruins, their people scattered like leaves in a gale. The great halls of Tirion, the glittering towers of Gondolin, the hidden groves of Doriath, all were gone, swallowed by time and tide. And those who remained stood amid the wreckage, their hands stained with deeds no song could fully absolve. The doom of Mandos, spoken so long ago, had come to pass with terrible precision, not by Morgoth's hand alone, but by their own. Pride had led them to exile. Vengeance had marched them into war, and an oath, sworn in fire and fury, had unraveled the very fabric of their destiny. Galadriel, last of the house of Fingon to walk freely in Middle-earth, gazed eastward where the sun rose over lands untouched by the wars of the Eldar. She had crossed the Helcaraxë in her youth, her heart alight with dreams of ruling a realm of her own. Now, with the silence of the ages settling around her, those dreams felt like relics of another life. The Noldor had sought to master Middle-earth, to carve their names into its bones, but the land had mastered them instead. Yet where others saw only loss, Galadriel saw something else, a chance to learn. To rule not with the arrogance of the old kings, but with the wisdom of one who had watched empires burn. She would stay, not for pride, not for power, but because Middle-earth, in all its scarred beauty, had become her home. And what of the Silmarils? Those radiant jewels, forged in a time of innocence, had become emblems of all that was brightest and most terrible in elven kind. One now shone in the heavens, a beacon of hope, carried by Eärendil's ship. Another lay lost in the earth's heart, its light buried like a secret. The third rested beneath the waves, its gleam a siren's call to those who dared dive too deep. No hands would ever hold them again, yet their legacy endured, not in gold or gemstone, but in stories, in the laments sung by mortal bards, in the whispered tales of dwarven miners who swore they glimpsed a flicker of silver in the darkest caves, in the quiet resolve of elves who would never again let love of beauty become obsession. The Noldor's tale was a tapestry of light and shadow, threaded with triumphs too costly to celebrate and losses too profound to mourn. They had been kings and kinslayers, heroes and fools, their fates woven so tightly together that even the valor could not untangle them. But as the first age faded into memory, one truth remained. Their story was not an ending, but a warning, a reminder that even the noblest hearts could be undone by the weight of their own choices. And for those who still walked the earth, Galadriel among them, the question lingered like a ghost. What would they build from the ashes? The second age dawned not with fanfare, but with quiet determination, like embers coaxed back to life after a great fire. The once mighty Beleriand had sunk beneath the waves, its ruins now little more than whispers in the songs of sailors. Yet from those ashes, new realms arose, their foundations laid by hands still trembling from the wars of old. The elves, weary but unbroken, turned their gaze eastward. Lindon, the last remnant of Osiriand, became a refuge under Gil-galad's rule, its harbors bustling with ships, bearing survivors and stories. Further inland, Celebrimbor, the last of Fëanor's line, sought not to reclaim his family's lost glory, but to forge something new, free from the weight of oaths and bloodshed. In a region, the halls of the Myrdain rang with the sound of hammers, not weapons, as elven smiths rediscovered the joy of creation without shadow. But Middle-earth was never meant to linger in peace for long. Though Morgoth had been cast into the void, his lieutenant remained, a shadow with many names, now known only as Sauron. Where his master had wielded brute force, Sauron mastered subtler arts, whispers in the dark, gifts offered with hidden hooks, and the slow corruption of hope into hunger. When he appeared to the elves in fair guise as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, few thought to question his wisdom. Had they forgotten so soon the scars of the Silmarils, the kin strife, the hollow victories bought with too much blood? Yet desire is a powerful blindness. The rings forged in Celebrimbor's workshops gleamed with promised tools to preserve, to heal, to stave off the decay of time itself. But 3 rings for the elves, 7 for the dwarves, 9 for mortal men, and 1, crafted in secret, to bind them all. The trap was set not with chains, but with longing. Men, too, carved their place in this new age. Numenor rose from the sea like a gift from the Valor, its people towering in stature and spirit, their ships slicing through waves no mortal had dared before. For a time, they were everything the Edain of old had hoped to be, wise, proud, unbroken by shadow, yet even their greatness carried the seed of downfall. The longer their lives stretched, the sharper their hunger for immortality grew. Sauron, ever patient, stoked that hunger like a smith tending a forge. By the time he willingly stepped onto their shores in chains, he had already won, for no chains could hold him. The king's ear became his throne, the people's fear his weapon. And when Numenor's fleets sailed against the undying lands in defiance of the ban, the sea itself rose to swallow them whole. The lesson was written in water and ruin. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The Second Age was not merely a time of rebuilding, it was a reckoning with the past. The elves, for all their wisdom, repeated the follies of their fathers, trading trust for trinkets. Men, blessed with unparalleled grace, let it curdle into arrogance, and Sauron, the heir of Morgoth's cruelty, proved that darkness need not be a hammer, it can be a needle, stitching itself into the fabric of the world, one thread at a time. The rings of power, those glittering symbols of hope, became the very instruments of their undoing. For in Middle-earth, the greatest tragedies are never born in fire and war, but in the quiet moments when good hearts forget to ask, what price lies hidden in the light? The light of the Silmarils never truly faded, it simply scattered, like embers carried on the wind, each spark igniting something new in the world they left behind. High above the clouds, Eärendil's star blazed with the radiance of the first Silmaril, a constant reminder that even in the darkest night, hope could still be found. Sailors charted their courses by it, lovers made wishes upon it, and elves whispered that its gleam was the last unbroken thread connecting Middle-earth to the undying West. But the jewel's legacy wasn't confined to the heavens. In the quiet glades of Lothlorien, Galadriel cupped a vessel of crystal and starlight, the phial that would one day guide Frodo through Shelob's lair. Filled with the light of Eärendil's star, it was more than a tool. It was a testament that even the smallest fragment of that ancient brilliance could still drive back the shadows. And then there were the hands that carried the Silmarils' legacy in their very bloodline. From Beren and Luthien sprang the lineage of Kings Aragorn, whose destiny was written in the light of the even star, bore the weight of that inheritance with every step. His love for Arwen mirrored the union of elf and mortal that had once defied the laws of gods, proving that the jewel's true power lay not in their glow, but in the bonds they had inspired. The Silmarils had been forged to capture light, yet their greatest magic was how they wove themselves into the tapestry of lives, transforming those who touched them. But for all their beauty, the jewel's story remained a warning etched in fire and blood. The Oath of Fëanor had proven how even the purest light could be twisted into a weapon, how love for something glorious could curdle into obsession. The battles fought over them, Alqualonde's shores stained crimson, Doriath's halls reduced to rubble, the havens of Sirion choked with smoke, were not just clashes of armies, but of ideals. Was it worth it? The question lingered in the silence after every war, in the hollow eyes of survivors who had lost everything for a glimmer of radiance they could never hold. Yet redemption flickered in the unlikeliest corners. Maglar, last of Fëanor's sons, wandering the shores with burns on his hands and a song of grief on his lips. Elrond, orphaned by the oath's cruelty, choosing healing over vengeance. Even the Valor, who had once turned away, sent their light back into the world through the very jewels that had caused so much pain. The Silmarils were gone, but their echoes shaped the ages to come, not as relics to be coveted, but as reminders that the truest treasures are those we refuse to let darkness claim. So when Samwise Gamgee held Galadriel's phial aloft in the black heart of Mordor, its glow piercing the gloom like a defiant laugh, it wasn't just starlight he wielded. It was the unbroken line of a story that began with a craftsman's pride and ended with a hobbit's courage. The Silmarils had been lost, but their light, that was never truly extinguished. It simply found new hands to carry it forward. The final chapter of the Silmarils' tale isn't written in victory or defeat, but in the quiet moments between, the hushed conversations around campfires, the trembling hands of those who outlived the wars, the way the wind carried the scent of salt and smoke long after the battles had ended. The jewels themselves were gone, scattered beyond reach, yet their absence weighed heavier than their light ever had. For those who remained, the true cost wasn't measured in fallen kingdoms or broken swords, but in the unanswerable questions that lingered like ghosts. Was it worth it? Did the oath justify the ruin? Could anything have been different? Look at Elrond, a child of refuge taken in by the very kin who had orphaned him, now forging a legacy of healing rather than vengeance. Or Galadriel, who had crossed the grinding ice with dreams of dominion, only to learn that wisdom grows not from power, but from the humility to let go. Even Maglar, last of Fëanor's sons, wandering the shores with his burns and his laments, became a living testament to the price of unchecked obsession. His songs, once filled with the glory of the Noldor, now carried only the ache of what had been lost. And yet there's always and yet, in these stories, the Silmarils' light didn't vanish. It transformed. In Eärendil's star, it became a guide for the lost. In the phial of Galadriel, a weapon for the helpless. In the lineage of Beren and Luthien, a promise that love could outlast even the darkest ages. The battles had been cataclysmic, yes, but their aftermath revealed something quieter and far more enduring. The resilience of those who chose to rebuild rather than repeat. The tragedy of the Silmarils wasn't just the blood spilled over them, but the way they mirrored the hearts that coveted them. For Fëanor, they were masterpieces to be possessed. For Morgoth, trophies to be hoarded. For Beren and Luthien, a means to prove that love could defy fate. And in the end, perhaps that's the lesson etched into every scorched battlefield and sunken realm. The value of a thing lies not in its brilliance, but in what we're willing to sacrifice for it, and what we refuse to let it cost us. So when the last pages of this saga turn, what remains isn't the echo of clashing steel, but the whispers of those who carried the light forward, not in jewels, but in choices. Not in oaths, but in the stubborn, quiet refusal to let darkness be the end of the story. The Silmarils are gone, but the light they held, that's still ours to carry. you.